So I thought we might start with a very short video, and this is the video of the Martu Leadership Programme, and it interviews some of the Martu mob that went through the leadership programme.
I tell them there's a lot of opportunities to go under the leadership program, and you can go a lot further from there. It'll take you a long way, and you meet a lot of people and see different places. Well, I think it's a good thing for all young Martus to learn about leadership, and it'll empower them in a way, make them a bit strong, and they can talk up for themselves and their communities. Like they might learn more about other things both ways, like in Martu way, Whitefellow way.
Like what I see through leadership, it's learning white law and finance and the rules, law books.
It's important for us to teach all this white law to our people because it's two laws colliding.
Leadership program para kang abini moral aja ganjil gua world be world ni mana ni ganjil ni well balar ni ni leadership ya yang gua aja kapamat banyak gua ni popular yang guna aja no uang kan aja ngurah gua.
It's a good message. It's learning and focusing. And like when you're focusing, and it's to get good, clear understanding and open your mind and eyes to look further. The old people, they wanted me to be part of the leadership so we can speak strong for our Wandis and for our families, kids. I wanted to show the example and be like a role model for my people in the community.
Well, leadership for me is about learning. This leadership is getting more stronger and stronger in the future. Feel good about yourself, and you can travel to another country, another place, learn lots of different things from the other communities, It's good. You can come back with that idea and work on it back home. Good on everybody. Everybody should do it.
These young boys that are stepping up, they will be a leader. I can tell you right now, I like what they are doing.
I don't want to stop doing this now. It sort of brings me, to stand up more, not only for myself, but I want to stand up for my people as well.
Australia is a one country, and we need to unite all Australians so white and black can learn together, working together. That's all leadership means to me, working together.
Now, some young fellas, I hear more times that every meeting we go down, I'm hungry, I want to learn more and more. That leadership program is helping me and helping them, and together we're learning and we want to continue.
I I think that for me is a really, really nice example of an evaluation where we actually discovered what changes were taking place for the people who are the centre of the programme. And I'll talk about the Marty Leadership Programme evaluation in a bit more detail later on. Essentially what was interesting about that was our initial perceptions of what outcomes were going to be achieved through the Marty Leadership Programme and what outcomes actually were in fact achieved were actually quite distinct. And going through the evaluation process allowed us to see that. I think before we start, I guess I just wanted to put a wee bit of context when we talk about evaluations. And for us anyway, evaluation needs to be considered as part of the entire cycle. It's not just about coming in at the end of the programme and doing an evaluation. If we think about the cycle of outcomes management more broadly, you've got 5 stages. You know, the design where you think about what does your logic model look like, what do the outcomes look like, how do we measure them, what are the indicators, right through to how you collect the data, analyse it, report on it, and then make decisions based on what you're finding. At every stage in that cycle, there are opportunities to do an evaluation. And at every stage in that cycle, there are opportunities to reflect on what you're doing, why you're doing it, and therefore how you change it. So I think whilst we talk about setting up and designing an evaluation, it's very important that it's not considered outside of your overall approach to strategy and outcomes management. I think the other big question when you think about evaluations is what stage of development are we at in terms of the programme? And for us, there's lots and lots of different evaluations. Very much appreciate that. From our perspective, we tend to put them into the 3 buckets: the developmental, the formative, and then the summative. And the developmental evaluation, again, lots of different names for it, but it's essentially trying, evaluating, reflecting, and then trying again in a cyclical process where you're feeling comfortable because there's lots of different prototypes to test. Your model's not yet developed yet, so lots of opportunities to try stuff, realize it's not working, and then adapt it. And often your audience for the developmental evaluation is your internal stakeholders as you're starting to build up your program. And lots of ways of doing this, you know, action research, human-centered design, all the good buzzwords. The second is the formative. Again, I think some people refer to this as process evaluation, and that's when your model's at that early stage where you're feeling quite comfortable that you've got the bare bones of it in place, but you want to test it to see whether or not what you did set out to achieve, there's indications that you actually are going to achieve that. There's a lots of questions that you can ask yourself here around the cost effectiveness of the programme. What impact do you think we're going to have? And where are the strengths and where are the weaknesses? But you're not so far down the line that you can't make changes to the model. And then you get the summative at the end, which is the model is established, and then you're asking the kind of exciting questions like, where can we go with this going forward? Did it work? What was the overall impact? And then how do we actually scale it or replicate it? And this is when you could do an SROI evaluation. This is also when you can start to think about your audience as being, you know, your external stakeholders, your funders, or your philanthropists. I think the other, and I find this triangle extremely useful, and it's 3 questions that we ask. I ask actually of everything I produce, to be honest with you. Your audience, your purpose, and rigor. First question is, who's going to read your evaluation? You know, who do you actually want to see it, and what do you want them to get from it as the first question? And the next question is your purpose. Why are you bothering? You know, what are the main messages that you want to get across, and what do you want to use the evaluation to do? Is it a matter of trying to influence a board? Are you trying to influence a decision? Are you trying to change somebody's mindset? Do you want to get feedback? All of this will determine the type of evaluation you take. And the last one is, how robust do we have to be? Does it have to be a really, really detailed quantitative analysis because you know that the purpose of it is to get funding and you know that the audience is going to be the board? Or it can be a quite light touch because the audience and purpose is different. And this is obviously cyclical, and I've written up here at the beginning of the process, but these are questions you should be asking all the way throughout. Every time you do a report, you should ask yourself these 3 questions. You know, what's the purpose of the report? Why am I doing it? Who's going to read it? How do I want to use the contents of it? So that's essentially where we're at in terms of how we think about evaluations. And I wanted to share, I've chosen 3 examples. These are my favourite examples, which is why I've got them up here. We've done lots of work with Indigenous communities, not just in WA, but across Australia. So I'll talk in a bit more detail about these 3 examples. And as Theo said at the end, it would be great to then hear from you guys your own experiences of doing similar work. The first is the work that we did with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet on their Indigenous protected areas and working on country programmes. We did an SROI of 5 IPAs and their range of programmes across Australia. There was two in WA. And essentially, PMNC had come to us because they wanted to understand the impact of their land management initiatives, because they were putting quite a lot of money into it, and they weren't very sure whether or not it was actually delivering on the results. And initially, I think what was really interesting about this was, initially the outcomes were set out to be employment focused. So the Ranger programme is meant to be an employment programme, and what we discovered through applying an SROI was that actually there were material, socioeconomic, cultural and environmental outcomes that were resulting from the programme. And because we were able to actually understand the material outcomes and the ones essentially the most important for the people participating in the Ranger programmes, they were then able to take that data and inform what data they should be collecting from the communities. Because before they were focusing only on the employment outcomes, when we went and spoke with the participants of the Ranger programmes, their views of the value were vastly different. And as a result, we were actually able to explain the potential that there was, and PMNC are now collecting different data. I think probably the most important takeaway for me anyway, when we did this, was the way that we approached the data collection. SROI, the principles of SROI are essentially, there's 7 of them. And you don't have to end up with a cost-benefit ratio. It's nice. You can have your $1 to $3, but that's not the important part. The important part for me anyway was that ongoing intensive stakeholder engagement. There's a really lovely story that kind of brought home to me how we have to be able to adapt our stakeholder engagement approach to the audience, particularly Indigenous communities. So we were over one of the communities in WA, and we had identified some of the rangers to talk to based on essentially their volunteering and coming forward. And the first lesson was we had to sit and just be quiet. It was really hard for me. But it was because first of all, we had to build that trust that they actually wanted to share with you the information that was important to them, and you're essentially asking them to share important values. And the second one was this ranger sat for a while, was very, very quiet, and then said, "Oh, look, tumbleweed." And we all went, "Yeah, tumbleweed." And he sat and again was quiet for a bit longer. And then he explained that actually for him, tumbleweed was an outcome because he had seen the land dry up and be quite destroyed because it wasn't being looked after. And for him, the tumbleweed indicated the land was starting to be revived because they were looking after it. So from our perspective, we had to be patient, but we also had to be ready to actually listen to what we were being told and not just assume that they hadn't understood the question, or because they weren't giving us the answer we expected to hear, it wasn't the right answer. And that was a really, really important consideration when we go about asking questions and actually using the language that is reflective of the audience in terms of who you're talking to. And going back to the 3 questions before, the audience might be your stakeholders, and you have to be able to reflect the language that they'll understand. And just so everyone here knows, the actual report that we gave to the Prime Minister and Cabinet is available online if anyone actually wants to go and read it. It's really interesting and gives a large number of recommendations to PMC around how they might start to really leverage some of the outcomes that the Ranger programmes are delivering. The second one is the Martu Leadership Programme with Kanyer Nimpa Jokorpa. As you saw from the video, KG was set up 2005, I think, and it was essentially set up to be a way to protect the Martu culture and create sustainable Martu communities. Now, the Martu mob are based over in the Pilbara, And I mean, they're quite incredible. I had the absolute privilege of spending quite a lot of time with them, spent some time with some of the Martu artists. And if you think about some of them have come out of the desert in the 1960s, had grown up without ever having contact with white fellas, and then had come across WA in the 1960s, and since then have had to adapt to a brand new way of life. So I mean, some of the stories that these people have told are really quite amazing. And what KJ is doing is trying to preserve their culture. And actually what was interesting, we were asked to support the developmental and summative evaluation of their new leadership program, and it was in collaboration with Griffith University, which is I believe in Queensland. And the reason that they wanted to do developmental evaluation was because this was a brand new pilot. It was completely new, it was very innovative. They had no idea if it was going to work or not. And the idea was they wanted to approach it through a co-design lens, because they recognized that they were trying to combine white fella world with Martu culture in a way that would encourage the Martus, as you heard from the video, to be able to adapt and to live comfortably whilst preserving their own culture. So it was really important that on an ongoing basis, the communities fed into the co-design of the programme, and very regular, every time an activity took place, people came back together, wrote up an assessment of it, reflected on it, did it work? Every time there was a presentation, wrote an assessment of it, came back, reflected on it, and then took it to the communities. Because the Martu Leadership Programme is for the communities, if it's not co-designed alongside them, it's not going to work. And what SVA did at the beginning was we developed a logic model and an impact measurement framework, and then supported the process of the developmental evaluation over the course of 3 years, and then came back in at the end to do the summative evaluation. And interestingly, what we found was that we actually had to revisit the entire logic model because of 3 years of continuous outcomes and continuous redesign of the programme. And this was quite interesting because I think it's quite a challenge to do a developmental evaluation, because you continuously have to rethink your baseline, and you continuously have to rethink how you capture the emerging outcomes so that you are always learning. And I think what was one of the big takeaways for us was that we changed the logic model, because at the beginning we thought all of the outcomes were very much linked to the individual, because that was our lens of putting in it. 3 years later, what we actually realized was that the majority of the outcomes were linked to the community or to the group as a whole, which was more valuable to them. And that meant that the leadership program was designed to help achieve those outcomes. I just wanted to share actually the logic model for the Martu Leadership Program. And I think what I like about where we ended up with this logic model is that it's reflective of their culture and the mission of the organization. It's not linear, it's not activity, participant, etc. It is very much focused. First of all, it puts the Martu at the center. So we use Martu language to describe outcomes because that's what resonates with them and that's what they understand. It has a long-term vision for the Martu people, and there is different outcomes for different stakeholder groups. And then you've also got the interconnectivity of the outcomes, because we recognize again that you don't have partnerships or culture or knowledge that sit outside of each other. They're actually all very much interrelated. And there's a bigger picture of this. And the idea of the circles is that they're meant to represent the water holes and the desert. Because again, Martu people recognize that there are sacred ground and they all know where the waterfalls are. So we designed a logic model that reflected their culture and reflected how they viewed the world. And I think, again, I appreciate that it requires quite a lot of patience to do this, but our big lesson was the logic model is not for us. It's for them, and if we want them to use it, then we need to make sure that it's useful and reflective for them. The last example is Gambina. Now, Gambina is a really lovely organisation based in Victoria, which is focused on supporting the transition from education to employment or vocational training. And what they're very much focused on involving all the community. It's not just about the child, it's about the contribution that the entire community makes to ensuring that children are able to make the transition successfully. The really fun thing about this evaluation was that we did their strategy back in 2005, and then they came back 12 years later and said, right, what have we achieved? And it's like, gosh, this is really cool. And I guess what we always encourage people to do is don't underestimate the effect that actually looking over a 12-year period can do. And again, they wanted to know, how do we improve our programme going forward? So we sat down and looked at all the reports they'd collected for the last 12 years. I think the most important part of this evaluation was being very clear from the beginning on what your evaluation question was. Because, I mean, 12 years of data, you could have asked anything. So we were very clear, what question do you want to be able to answer with this evaluation? Because getting clear from the beginning will then, that essentially then helped adapt our approach. For us, there was probably 5 lessons in terms of when we did all of these evaluations, which made them usable. And again, going back to my point at the beginning, if they're not going to be used, then they're not a good evaluation. Specific engagement with the beneficiary, and I mentioned that before, be ready to engage with as many stakeholders as is feasible. And I think be ready to spend a lot of time on country and be ready to recognise that actually your first visit might not yield any results, because it's a long-term process where you're building up trust, especially when you're asking for information that might be considered quite private. I've been working up on Palm Island, which is an island in the far north Queensland, and I'd be up and down there about 6 or 7 times. And somebody still says to me, "Oh, you're new." I'm like, "No, I'm not." But it's just that ongoing trust that I think is important to build. Specific about the most important questions. And again, I think the most important questions come out of if you're very specific about the most valued outcomes in your logic model and very clear about what are the most important changes you want to see, that will lead into them being very clear about the most specific questions. Specific about the end uses and end users, covered off. The last 2, I think, are most relevant for the Indigenous communities, which is cultures placed front and centre. We did a wonderful piece of work with Tupu Matakana, which is a commissioning agency in the North Island in New Zealand. And we ended up with a logic model that was shaped like a Maori warrior, because for them, that's what resonated with them and that's what they reflected themselves in. And also, we used their language. And that flexible approach that reflects context, which is, again, being ready and willing to accept that you do a logic model, you find some stuff out, doesn't work, be ready to then be flexible and change and adapt it, because if it's not useful to the people you're working with, then it's not going to be used. And just a reminder that all of these characteristics should be relevant and apparent in all of the work that you actually do around outcomes management. As I said, it's part of a cycle. It's not just an evaluation at the end, but it's actually the way that you approach all the elements. You should be mindful of who you're working with, why you're doing the work, and what you actually want to get out of it. But I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
I always sort of find it difficult to cut off these interesting conversations, but I'm sure there's lots of questions that are coming up, so we just want to be ready to take them now. So if anyone's got a question for Gillian.
Hi, Gillian. That was very interesting, just wanted to say. So I'm Sandy from the Education Department. I just have a question regarding the timing. So in evaluations, obviously, they often take a long time, and often when the evaluation results actually come out, they're almost out of date. How do you kind of work with that so we can actually get the best use out of our evaluations?
If you want to use them internally to make a decision, then if they're published later on, does that matter? If it's to let the public know how you're spending your money, again, I guess my question to you is, does it matter if they're out of date, depending on the reason why you're doing an evaluation in the first place?
And I guess just picking up on that point, the issue I saw there was a lot of the developmental evaluation was about improving the program, so people were getting the information they needed to develop and test the program as they were going along, which was quite okay.
Yeah, and I realise for government, developmental evaluations can be quite tricky, because we've worked with them where we sort of suggested it and it can be quite hard. What we've suggested is then 2 or 3 midpoint evaluations over time, so that when you come to the end point, you're not actually learning anything new. So maybe like one after a year, another one after a year, both of them process evaluations. And it means that you're not you're not going to change the model quite as much, but you've got that flexibility. And then when you do your endpoint, you're not going to be surprised.
Hi there, Susan Hill from Edith Cowan University.
Hi.
Just have a question about the social return on investment with the Matu project. Could you just give us I know there's a lot of detail behind it, but just some key points about how you went about that, what factors you used and what you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So social return on investment came out of the UK. It's based on actuarial principles of trying to add financial value to specific outcomes. And please jump in if you have any thoughts on this, because I'm sure you've a lot more experience than I have. And basically there's 7 principles that underlie it, and it's just a recognition that you want to be able to apply a financial value to something that's less tangible. So there's a principle that talks about stakeholder engagement. There's one that talks about dead weight, which is essentially what would happen anyway. There's one that talks about attribution, which is how do you make sure that your program is contributing and recognizing that there might be other stuff going on around about you that's also contributing to the same outcome. There's then basically the first half of an SROI would be establishing your logic model and establishing your outcomes. And we then do an exercise to identify the most important changes that an organisation sets out to achieve. We'll then go out and do quite considerable stakeholder engagement, where we start to try to understand what outcomes are meaningful. So then, with the Martu mob, we spent quite a lot of time with them, asking them, what are the most important changes for you? Are these right? Do these feel right? And then what you end up with are a set of the meaningful outcomes. And the meaningful ones are the ones that you then want to be able to place a financial value on. And normally when we do the stakeholder engagements, you ask questions around preferred, oh gosh, oh, that's terrible, I'm forgetting the real words now. It's essentially trying to get an idea of what would you have spent the money on to have gotten the same outcomes, and the revealed preference, which is that what would you spend the money on, and also asking questions around how else could you have delivered these outcomes in another way, and then we use market values. And then there's a series of calculations you do that essentially take into account the value you place on the outcomes, remove dead weight, remove the attribution, and then you end up with a value. I think when it came to the Martu leadership program, the value at the end actually wasn't something that we really were particularly interested about. It was more around the approach of engaging with the communities and starting to really understand, is there anything else out there that would help you achieve the same outcomes, and is there anything else that you think is of real importance to you? And actually we didn't end up using the financial value at the end, because no one really cared about the financial value. It was more around the outcomes that people were talking that they had managed to deliver. In the report, I believe, for the PM&C report, they've got a detailed description of the calculations that we did, if you're interested.
Hi, thanks for that presentation. It's Peter Wilkins. I was very interested in just continuing with the Martu Leadership Program. You talked about the shift from outcomes, which were really looking at the individuals on the program compared to the impact on the wider community. How did you grapple with the attribution aspect as it went to community level, when there are so many programs and factors in play at a community level?
So I guess this goes to the point of we asked them. You ask those questions. Do you feel there's anything else? And I think with the leadership program, it was quite a unique, very Martu leadership program that was very much focused on helping them navigate both worlds. So when asking, as you saw in the video, when asking the Martu mob who'd gone through the program, is there anything else that you do in your lives, any other programs that you come across that help you achieve these outcomes? They said no. So, and I think this is where the stakeholder engagement is so important. And I appreciate that everyone does it, but being very, very clear and spending a lot of time asking these questions. What else goes on in your lives that you achieve these outcomes? What else do you do that helps you achieve these skills? And that's how we accounted for attribution.
I just wanted to thank you for that. I think it was a really great introduction to the importance of being a little bit flexible, to being culturally appropriate and fitting in around the client's needs and being conscious of that sort of thing, as opposed to, I guess, in some cases, some of our evaluations are a bit sort of stuck in a mode and we do this and we have to do this because we think it's important to do it this way. And we don't always hit the mark in terms of meeting the client needs or having something that is really useful. And particularly in this case where it was developmental and you're really working out how does this complex program go, and rather than having predetermined measurements, being flexible enough and brave enough to say, let's work it out first before we tie ourselves down. So I just want, if we can just give Gillian a round of applause for that, thank you.